All right, today we're talking about a true architect of modern India, a figure of incredible complexity and power, B.R. Ambedkar. This is a story about a man who fought for liberation on so many different fronts, and we're going to break down exactly how he did it.
So get this, the same guy who basically laid the groundwork for India's central bank also spearheaded a massive religious revolution. How does that even happen? That's the puzzle we're going to piece together. You'll see that for Ambedkar, it wasn't about tackling just one problem. It was about a total fight for equality, and he used every single tool in his arsenal to do it.
So here's our game plan. We're going to look at his toolkit piece by piece. First, we'll dig into what drove him personally. Then, we'll see how he fought for political power and, surprisingly, for economic stability. After that, we'll get into his really radical spiritual path. And finally, we'll wrap up by looking at the incredible legacy he left behind.
Okay, so where does a mission like this even begin? Well, it didn't just start with Ambedkar himself. You actually have to go back a generation, to his father, who had this incredibly powerful idea that education could be a weapon against the system. Now, before we go any further, we need to get some context straight. The community Ambedkar came from was referred to in British India as the depressed classes. This was the official term for Dalits, or untouchables, people who were systematically just shut out of everything. We're talking basic rights, jobs, you name it. And you really have to grasp that to understand the enormous mountain he was trying to climb.
And this is where his father, Ramji Sakpal, comes in. This wasn't just any dad. He was a subedar in the army, he knew English fluently, he became a teacher, and he was absolutely convinced that education was the only way his son could break free. The sacrifices he made were huge. And you gotta understand, this wasn't about just getting a diploma to land a decent job. For them, education was a pure act of defiance.
So, with that foundation, that spirit of defiance built through education, Ambedkar moves on to his first big strategy, getting a seat at the table. He knew deep down that if his people didn't have a real political voice, nothing would ever truly change.
And man, this leads to one of the most intense political showdowns you can imagine. It's 1932. In August, Ambedkar scores this huge win. The British agree to give the depressed classes their own separate electorates. But then, just a month later, M.K. Gandhi starts a fast, to the death, protesting it. He feared it would split the Hindu community forever. The pressure on Ambedkar was just unbelievable, and in a matter of days, he had to sign a compromise, the Poona Pact.
So what did he actually give up? What was the big deal? Well, the original plan, the communal award, was for separate electorates. Basically, Dalit voters would elect Dalit leaders. Simple. This meant those leaders were only accountable to their community. But the compromise, the Poona Pact, changed all that. It created reserved seats, sure, but in a joint electorate. So now a Dalit candidate needed votes from higher caste people to win. See the difference? It completely changed the game from direct representation to a kind of forced coalition. And Ambedkar's own words really hit home how big a loss this was. The original deal gave Dalits a double vote, one for their own candidate and one in the general election. He called it a political weapon beyond reckoning. To have that in his grasp and then have to give it up, you can imagine how painful that was. It was a harsh lesson in the limits of just fighting on the political front. So after that bruising political fight, Ambedkar pivots. He knew politics wasn't enough. And this is where we see another side of him, Ambedkar, the brilliant economist. He understood that true freedom, well, it isn't possible if your economic life is in constant chaos. And he wasn't just thinking about his own community. He was thinking about the whole nation. You know, this part of his story often gets missed. We think of him as a social justice champion, and he was, but he was also an economic visionary. Think about it. If you're part of a community that has zero generational wealth, an unstable economy isn't just a minor problem, it's a total disaster. He saw that a stable currency and a strong, independent central bank were the bedrock. It would create a system where even the most vulnerable people could have a fighting chance to build something. And his influence here wasn't just some vague idea. It was direct. It's a really clear path. Step 1, he writes this incredible book, The Problem of the Rupee. Step 2, a major British commission, the Hilton Young Commission, basically leans heavily on his ideas to figure out India's financial system. And step 3, boom, the Reserve Bank of India is established in 1935, built on the framework he designed. He literally wrote the blueprint. Okay, so he's tackled politics, he's tackled economics, but even with all that, after decades of fighting, he came to believe it still wasn't enough.
Something more fundamental had to change. This led him to the third, and maybe the most radical part of his plan, a full-blown spiritual revolution. Get this, in 1935, the very same year the central Bankian vision was created, Ambedkar reaches this earth-shattering conclusion. He decides that the caste system is just baked into Hinduism, that you couldn't reform it away, that for real liberation, you had to leave the entire system behind. And so, he makes a public declaration. He's going to find a new religion. And he absolutely did not do this alone. Fast forward to October 1956. There's this massive ceremony, and Ambedkar officially converts to Buddhism. And with him, on that one day, an unbelievable 365,000 of his followers convert too. This was way more than a personal decision. It was the birth of a movement. But he didn't just pick a religion off the shelf. He re-engineered it. He created his own school of thought called Navayana Buddhism, the new vehicle. And it was a pretty radical take. He stripped away some of the traditional ideas like karma and rebirth, things he felt were used to justify inequality. Instead, he focused on Buddhism as a practical, rational guide for achieving equality and justice right here, right now, on Earth. And to make sure everyone understood that this was a clean break, he had his followers take 22 specific vows. And these were not subtle. They were a total declaration of independence. I mean, they explicitly say things like, I will not worship Brahma, Vishnu, or Mahesh. And even more directly, I renounce Hinduism, which is based on inequality. There was no ambiguity. It was a complete and total rejection of the old way. So you have this three-part strategy: political, economic, and spiritual. What was the result? What's the footprint he left behind? Let's take a look at the legacy. Well, each one of those fronts had a lasting impact. That political fight, even though it ended in a compromise, led to the system of reserved seats in government for scheduled castes, which is the modern term, and that's still in place today. His economic vision, it gave India its central bank, a cornerstone of the economy. And his spiritual revolution, it gave millions of people a brand new, empowered identity through the Dalit Buddhist movement. And the numbers really tell the story here. I mean, look at this. Data from the 2011 census shows that more than 2/3 of all Buddhists in India are from scheduled caste backgrounds. That is not an accident. That is the direct statistical proof of the movement Ambedkar kicked off back in '56. Today, that movement includes more than 8.4 million people. It's seriously one of the biggest examples of mass religious conversion in recent history. It's really a powerful testament to his vision of creating a new path, a new identity, both spiritually and socially. So that brings us to a final thought, a question for you really. Ambedkar had this incredible toolkit, right? He used political leverage, he used economic design, and he used spiritual rebellion. When you look at the fights for equality happening all over the world today, which of those tools do you think is the most powerful one we have?